Hi everyone and welcome back. This is Mindy Eggen. In today's video, we are going to be creating two Father's Day cards using the new Hoppy Days Cling and Clear combo from Tailored Expressions. To start off, I'm going to show you the supplies that I'll be using today, starting with the Hoppy Days Cling and Clear combo stamp set. I'll show you this in detail in a little bit. I also have the Bokeh stencil, the Arglye stencil. I'll be using the Simple Strips die, and the Arglye stamp, and then I also have the Simple Strips Man, Myth, Legend stamp set. The cardstock I'm using is Sugar Cube cardstock, and I'm showing you spearmint, but I actually changed my mind and end up using pineapple cardstock and Oreo cardstock. For inks, I have lemon meringue, pineapple, Dijon, spearmint, mushroom, poppy seed, VersaMark, Oreo, and Sugar Cube ink. For my remaining supplies, I have clear and white embossing powder. I also have the Sugar Cube glitter. I have an anti-static powder tool, my tweezers. I have a quickie glue pen and a liquid applique, my Scotch removable tape, foam squares, and my Scotch tape runner. And I'll also be using my blending brushes to do some ink blending on my stencils. So now here is a closer look at the Hoppy Days Cling and Clear combo. It is a red rubber stamp for the most part. It also has coordinating dies to die cut out the shadow under the beer mugs. You have a couple dies to die cut them out individually or as a group. And then this is the clear set, so you can stamp in the color of your mugs or you can color them in. Before I do my stamping, I'm going to do a little die cutting. So I have a couple strips here cut from the Sugar Cube cardstock. I'm lining up my die into that cardstock and I'm going to die cut these out. So I have two sets of beer mugs and I want to keep one of these negative pieces. I found this was a really great trick for lining up my stamps perfectly. Now I'm loading my beer mugs into my Misti Stamping tool and I'm going to stamp this down onto the Misti grid paper. I did remove the foam insert from my Misti since these are foam mounted, and then I'm bringing in that negative piece and I'm lining that up over that image that we just stamped. That's just kind of a guide for us so we can line everything up perfectly. Now I'm going to bring in my positive piece, line that up into that negative space, and ink up my image with the Oreo ink and stamp that down. So I have an absolutely perfect edge all the way around. I'm going to just pop this one out and I'm going to bring in my other piece and stamp that as well. So you could really do a bunch of these all at once in no time at all. Once these are stamped, I'm going to be able to stamp the inside of my beer mug. So I'm taking the clear set from this stamp set, lined that up over one of the beer mugs, and you could stamp both of them at once, but I just felt a little more confident doing these one at a time. So I lined that clear image up with that image that's on my grid paper. That way I knew it was in perfect placement and I could bring in my positive piece and stamp that down. I am stamping this in pineapple ink and I'll bring in my other one and do that one right away as well. So you could really do both beer mugs at the same time if you wanted to save a little bit of time. After this one is stamped, I'm going to line up that clear image once again with the kind of base image I stamped on that Misti grid paper. Once I'm happy with that placement, I can stamp this one down as well. Now, I'm in Wisconsin and we have Leinenkugel's beer in our area. So they actually have different colors of beer. I think there's a berry wise, so I could have stamped this in like a berry color and that would have looked really cool too. Guess it depends on the preference of whoever you're giving this card to. Once I have these all stamped in, I'm going to bring in a handy little tool that I have not used in forever. And this is Liquid Appliqué. I used this years ago on Santa's beards and I never thought to use this on beer mugs, but it sure works great. So you just, it's a liquid form, so you're just kind of coloring in the foam of the beer. And I'm making sure to color inside of my line. I wanted that black line to really stand out. Now I believe on the tube of the Liquid Applique it says that you can leave this overnight, but I'm speeding up the process by using my heat tool and I'll show you that in just a moment. Another thing you could use this Liquid Applique for is just as some embellishments on your background or snow. You could use it on hearts for Valentine's. So many great ways to use this that I completely forgot about this, and I'm glad that Taylor reminded me of it. Now I am stepping it up just a little bit. I thought I'd experiment, and I am dumping on a little bit of the sugar cube glitter on top of that liquid applique because it's still wet. It does take a long time to dry. So I sprinkled on that glitter, tapped off any of the excess, and then I am making sure that my heat gun is really nice and hot, holding my image with my tweezers to keep my fingers safe, and then heating that up, and it puffs up, and it is so cool in person. I tried to show a close-up towards the end, but it's way cooler in person how it kind of puffs up. Now that I have my images done, I'm going to work on a background for one of the beer mugs. So I have a piece of sugar cube cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I put a little bit of adhesive down on my grid paper here to hold that in place. And then I'm bringing in the Bokeh stencil, which was really, really cool to add with these beer mugs. I'm lining up that first layer with the grid lines of my mat. And then I held that down with some low tack tape, and I'm bringing in lemon meringue. So I have 3 different colors that I'm using here today. You really could probably get away with 1 or 2 and just apply more ink or go heavier handed with them. But I did choose 3. So I ink blended that first layer on, and then I'm going to bring in layer 2 of the Bokeh stencil. And all of the Tailored Expressions stencils are labeled in the bottom corners. So it'll show you 1, 2, or 3. In the Bokeh stencil, I'm not really sure it matters, but I did go in order. Now this second color here is pineapple, which is my all-time favorite yellow color. And then once I have all of that ink blended on, I'll remove this stencil, and it's already looking just really super cool, kind of like bubbles in the background. And then I'm going to bring in layer 3. And now for layer 3, I am going to use the Dijon ink. So it's a little bit darker of a yellow. And I'm going to blend that on over top of everything. So like I said, you really could maybe go with 1 or 2 colors and just go heavier handed. But I thought the 3 different colors and that transition looked really neat. Off screen, I trimmed this panel down to 3 1/2 by 4 3/4, and I also trimmed 3 more pieces of white cardstock to that same size and layered them together, and I'm adding that blended panel on top. This is just adding dimension to the back of my panel, and it's complete coverage, so I'm not worried about any areas dipping because of foam tape. So I have a piece of white cardstock cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches that I layered on top of pineapple cardstock. And then it dawned on me that I did not stamp my sentiment. So I'm going to carefully try and do this. I do this way more times than I should. I always put my card together and then realize I did not stamp my sentiment. So to do this, I did remove that foam insert once again because these are foam stamps that I'm stamping down. This is kind of the shadow area for under my beer mugs, and I carefully stamped that, I believe, in the mushroom ink. And then I have my sentiment here that I lined up right underneath that, and I'm stamping that in Oreo ink. So I am stamping really, really careful. I'm not pushing too hard. I would rather stamp it 2 or 3 times versus messing it up by stamping too hard that first time. And then I'm finishing this off by adding foam squares behind my beer mugs and popping that up right over my shadow area. So that finishes off my first card. So if you have any beer lovers, this is a great set for them. Now on to my second card. I am using the Arglye Stamp and Stencil. This is also a red rubber stamp. So I'm mounting this into my Misti tool. I did remove that foam insert of the Misti. And then I'm taking a piece of sugar cube cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I'm going to put just a little bit of adhesive on the back just so that is going to secure it in place on my Misti. I placed that cardstock over my background and then closed my Misti door or my Misti tool backwards. That way my cardstock is just in perfect placement. I'm going to prep it with an anti-static powder tool, and I'm going to ink up the Arglye background with a VersaMark ink and stamp that down. Then I'm going to sprinkle on clear embossing powder. I'm going to be doing kind of an embossed resist, so this is adding a little bit of interest to the background, but not getting too carried away with color. So after I tapped off that excess, I'm melting that embossing powder with my heat tool, and then I'm going to bring it over to my grid paper and start stenciling on the Arglye background. Now I apologize, mine is a little bit dirty. I was playing with some dark colors, so this isn't going to hurt anything. It's just a little kind of darker there in some areas. I lined up my cardstock in that A2 orientation on my grid paper and then lined my first layer of the Argyle background over the top. And I'm just lining that up over that 6x6 orientation on the grid mat. I love using the grid mat for my stenciling. It just makes things so much easier. And then once I had everything lined up, I am inking on poppy seed ink with a blending brush. Once I finish this layer, I'll remove that and bring in the second layer of the stencil, and I am going to ink blend on mushroom ink. Now, I completely forgot to ink blend those squares that are on the stencil. Those kind of help you line everything up perfectly, but because of the design of this stencil, I just looked through the open areas and lined up my X's that I had heat embossed. So you can do that either way. So this one, like I said, is mushroom. I'll remove this second layer and bring in the third layer. And the third layer is going to be ink blended on with spearmint ink. I haven't used this actually yet, so I was giving a little bit of love to the spearmint ink, which I thought was just a really great combo with the mushroom and the poppy seed. And then I can remove this stencil and I'm going to take a cloth and buff over the entire background. That is just going to remove any of the excess ink that is over my embossed areas and really help make that white of the cardstock underneath pop through just a little bit more. For the sentiments for my card today, I am using the new Simple Strips Man, Myth, Legend, which has a lot of really great sentiments on here, a lot of fun ones. So I am going to stamp this on Oreo cardstock that I have loaded in my Misti tool. And I'm going to line that up, pick that up at the door of the Misti, prep this with my anti-static powder tool. And here is the magic. I am taking sugar cube ink, so a white pigment ink, and I'm inking up my image. This is going to make the white embossing practically flawless by starting with the sugar cube ink versus VersaMark. So I stamp that down. I'm going to stamp it one more time. And one of the reasons that this works so well is that pigment ink stays wet just a little bit longer, just like VersaMark would. But it's kind of completing everything. It's filling in all the nooks and crannies that the embossing powder might miss. So I'm sprinkling on that white embossing powder, tapping off the excess, and then there were a couple little hairs, little bits that were where they were not supposed to be, so I'm removing them with a paintbrush and then melting this with my embossing tool. Now to make these pop just a little bit more, I am buffing over this with a Swiffer cloth, and that just removes any of that excess anti-static powder tool I used. I'm going to line up the Simple Strips die, hold it in place with low tack tape, and run that through my die cut machine. And now I completed this card the same as I had the previous ones. I trimmed it down to 3.5 by 4 3/4 and layered with white cardstock cut to that same size to give it dimension. And I added it to an Oreo cardstock base. Then I added my beer mugs onto the front with some foam squares, and I'm taking 3 of the Simple Strips and adding them with a tape runner. So my card is going to say, Happy Father's Day to an amazing guy. Yes, the card is the gift. So this is great. My husband and I don't exchange gifts for Mother's Day and Father's Day, so this was really fun. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and this gives you some ideas for Father's Day cards or even birthday cards. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you again soon.